This man was the Nazis' expert on all things Irish. He drew up elaborate plans to get the IRA to fight on the side of the Nazis against the British. His name is Helmut Klisman, Abwehr agent. He arrived in Ireland in June 1948. This man became Ireland's leading educational publisher. During the war, he was a member of the SS. His name is Albert Folens, of the Nazi Flemish SS. He arrived in Ireland in October 1948. This man was exposed as a war criminal and sentenced to death for collaboration with the Nazis. However, by 1970, he had penetrated the Fianna Fáil party and was at the centre of Ireland's notorious arms trial. His name is Albert Lykes, of the Belgian Black Brigade. He arrived in Ireland in May 1948. This man was Hitler's favourite soldier, leading a crack team of commandos on a daring mission to rescue Mussolini. He became known as the most dangerous man in Europe. His name is Otto Scarface Skorzeny, of the Waffen-SS Commandos. He arrived in Ireland in May 1959. In 1945, as a naive 16-year-old boy, I joined the Royal Air Force and was dispatched to Burma at the end of the war against the Japanese. On leave in Ireland, I wasn't allowed to wear my uniform because of Irish neutrality, something that irritates me to this day. When I returned home from the Royal Air Force in 1947, people who were part of the Nazi terror were being allowed into Ireland. On my journey so far, I've discovered that official Ireland seemed to turn a blind eye as Nazi war criminals responsible for some of the worst excesses of the Nazi regime used Ireland to escape justice at the end of the war. But there is another story. In this episode, I will investigate the Nazis and their collaborators who came to Ireland seeking sanctuary and made a new life for themselves, and how they penetrated into the very core of Irish society. These former Nazis played a leading role in the story of post-war Ireland. I want to discover who they were and how they came to be in my country. My journey begins with the extraordinary story of how Nazi Germany attempted to elicit Irish Republican support in their war against Britain. Central to their plans was Helmut Klisman, one of the Nazis' chief experts on Ireland.
Helmut Klisman is from Aachen in Germany, and he arrived in Ireland as a student in the early 1930s. He soon became head of the German Academic Exchange, which was a group that would facilitate Irish students who wanted to go and study in Germany and German students who would like to go and study in Ireland.
I've discovered that in the 1930s there existed an Irish branch of the Nazi Party, the Ausland Organisation. As an expatriate German, Helmut Klisman became involved with the group.
During the 1933-1934 period, expatriate German and Austrian people living in Ireland felt the need to come together and form the Irish branch of the Nazi Party. Well, Klisman, as a German living in Ireland, as an expatriate German living in Ireland, got involved with the Nazi Party. It was a natural thing to do.
The AO, or Auslandsorganisation, is the German overseas affiliate of the Nazi Party. It existed in most countries all over the world, including Ireland. Klisman certainly went to AO functions. He certainly hobnobbed with AO individuals.
He was also involved with Irish republicanism. He had become friendly with Frank Ryan. He also had become friendly with Sean MacBride. He met a young lady from Sligo who's from a very Republican family named Elizabeth Mulcahy, and he married her. So he was very involved with Irish republicanism, but also very, very involved with Nazism. And so these two elements of Helmut Klisman became very important in later years during the war years.
Klisman always denied that he was spying before the war, but he certainly saw the strategic importance of Ireland. On the 1st of September 1939, the Second World War began when Germany invaded Poland. By the 12th of September, all members of the German community in Ireland, including Klisman, were recalled to Germany.
Klisman actually goes to work for the Foreign Ministry. He becomes sort of an ad hoc advisor on Irish affairs. He eventually gets inducted into the Army. His talent and background is spotted. He is put into the Brandenburg Regiment, which was essentially the German Special Forces, and they put him to work planning operations involving Ireland.
After that, he was transferred into Abwehr, which is German military intelligence. So he was regarded as being a spy, and a very good one at that. He had, of course, great IRA contacts. And there would have been a unity of goals between the IRA and German military intelligence, because both of them wanted to defeat Britain. The IRA wanted to kick the British out of the 6 counties. If Germany could get a foothold in Ireland, it would make it much, much easier to attack Britain.
One of Klisman's first moves was to convince his bosses in German intelligence to liberate his old friend, the former IRA leader Frank Ryan. Ryan had been languishing in a Spanish prison after being captured, fighting against Franco during the Spanish Civil War. Klisman saw Ryan not only as a friend, but the key to getting IRA help for the Nazis' plan to invade Britain. Ryan was released from his Spanish prison with German assistance in July 1940.
Was he content then to be used by the Nazis against the British?
Yes.
Was he a tool of the Germans?
No. He would have been acting in his own and in Irish interests. As an Irish nationalist, this was an opportunity for defeat of England.
Frank Ryan and Klisman and some others came up with the idea that we could recreate the idea from the First World War of Roger Casement to take British prisoners of war of Irish extraction and form them into a unit of Irish nationals which could be used for operations in Ireland. One of the difficulties with the scheme was the fact that they overestimated the reception that they got. They had thought they were going to be welcomed with open arms, that they could turn these people against, their evil British colonial imperial masters, and in fact they were almost physically attacked. It was really perfectly mirrored the experience that Casement had in the First World War, in the sense that it was just a tremendous failure.
But with the German invasion of Russia, Nazi interest in Ireland waned, and Klisman's plan of co-opting the IRA onto the side of the Nazis ended in failure.
Once Ireland no longer was viable, Klisman was sent to North Africa. He later returned to normal military duties in Europe, and after the war he was captured, put into a prisoner of war camp.
Helmut Klisman was held at Bad Norndorf, which was a notorious POW camp run by the British after the war.
Were you tortured?
Yes, I was.
Often?
Quite a number of times, yeah.
In what way?
Yeah, I stood in cold water for 12 hours, or you were not allowed to lie down for 24 hours. You had to march around in the room. You could not even sit down. It was for a whole year in solitary confinement. When I left this prison, I weighed 75 pounds. I could be about 4 stones, I suppose.
He had friends who got him back to good health. His wife, on the other side, back in Ireland, managed to get him a permission to enter Ireland to her contact with Sean McBride, who, of course, was a friend of Helmut's from early on during the 1930s.
Then I made up my mind I would have to go illegally to Ireland. And I walked over the Bavarian mountains into Austria and then crossed into Italy and took a train then to Rome, and came from Rome, after waiting 3 weeks there, by air to Shannon Airport.
He set up a chemical importation business in Ireland, and the business still lasts to this day. It's a very successful company. He ran it very, very well. Aside from business, he was involved in various other projects, one of them being Amnesty International. He was one of the early members of Amnesty in Ireland. So it's interesting that he used his personal experiences of human rights abuses and put it to some good use in getting Amnesty International going in Ireland.
To understand how Clisman was able to slip into Ireland after the war, we must return to the end of the Second World War and the early days of the Cold War, when Ireland, like most Western European countries, didn't see Nazism as the enemy, but communism.
The situation at the end of World War II between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was, of course, very fraught. The Western Allies were concerned that the Soviet army had been so successful on the battlefield and was certainly the largest army in Europe at the time that it could quite possibly overrun all of Western Europe and not stop at Berlin. At that stage, both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union realised that in all likelihood they could easily come to blows with each other.
De Valera in 1945 and 1946 on occasions actually reflects similar concerns. De Valera actually writes to a correspondent on one occasion saying that he expected, if Europe wasn't careful, that the Soviet Union could overrun Western Europe, and he feared that there could be a major world war with atomic weapons and everything between the Americans and the Soviet Union at some stage. So he was deeply pessimistic about that. And I think that reflects wider concerns in Ireland. The Catholic Church was deeply concerned about what they saw as the persecution of the Catholic Church in post-war Europe. The Catholic Church's view of communism was that it was anti-Christian, and that communism had been condemned by various popes in the past. They believed that communism was also immoral and that it would bring about the levelling of societies and the destruction of Christian values, and particularly Catholic values.
In the 1930s, the Church had established various understandings, various concordats with fascist Italy and also with Nazi Germany. This isn't to say necessarily that the Church was pro-Nazi, but the Church was certainly anti-communist. The Church would often have something of an ambivalent view towards Nazism. It saw it as a very strong anti-communist force.
The public was, if anything, even more hostile to communism than the political elites. There are mass demonstrations on occasions against communism. The communists are physically attacked in Dublin and elsewhere by mobs. And so it was very widespread. And if you look at the press, which indicates at least a level in its correspondence pages of public opinion, it's overwhelmingly anti-communism. There's virtually nobody in any of the newspapers who supports communism.
Irish anti-communism affected the refugee policy by having a preference towards those fugitives from the continent who were predominantly Catholic and who, in a great lot of cases, had collaborated with the Germans against communists during the war. These people were essentially given the green light to enter Ireland.
This meant that in 1947 the Irish state turned a blind eye to some fleeing Nazis who entered Ireland. One group which took full advantage of this was the right-wing Catholic nationalist movement in Belgium. This group would penetrate deep into the heart of post-war Irish society. The Flemish are a Dutch-speaking minority ethnic group that live in the north of Belgium. Predominantly Catholic, in the first half of the 20th century, they were oppressed by the French-speaking majority. The Flemish people demanded independence from Belgium. In 1940, when the Nazis overran Belgium, right-wing Flemish nationalists flocked to their cause. They saw the Nazis as their ticket to independence.
The main political party was called the Flemish National League, and this Flemish National League went into collaboration with the Germans from the early start on.
The kinds of collaboration that took place in Flanders itself were those Flemish nationalists who formed their own Flemish nationalist militia with a view to this being the nucleus of a future Flemish army. There were those Flemish who joined the German SS to go and fight in Russia, or the Eastern Front, against the Soviets. And there were a great many Flemish nationalists who did that. And it's interesting that for a lot of them, the motivation was probably greater that it was a defence of Catholic or Christian civilization against the godless hordes of communism.
The SS was the Nazi Party's private army. They were the organization behind the Holocaust, and their military arm, the Waffen-SS, was in the front line when Germany invaded Russia.
Fascist tendencies were already there before the First World War, and the Flemish National League wanted to obtain also the full political power for themselves, getting rid of every form of democracy.
When the Allies liberated Europe, those Flemish nationalists who had joined the SS had to flee the continent. These men saw Ireland as the perfect safe haven. Inspired by a combination of Catholic anti-communism and Irish republicanism, they made their way here, helped by elements within the church and the willingness of the Irish to aid dedicated anti-communists.
The fact that Ireland was Catholic and that you had those links, predominantly again through the Catholic Church, between Flemish clergy and Irish clergy, and a number of Flemish clergy were able to facilitate the escape of certain Flemish nationalists, again obtain travel documents for them, provide them with safe houses, these kinds of things that enabled them to, in most cases, slip across the border to the Netherlands and then fly directly to Ireland.
Once here, these Nazi collaborators penetrated every level of Irish society. Dublin, 1978, and demonstrators are vainly trying to save the Viking settlement on Wood Quay. Among the protesters is Staff van Veldhoven. During the war, he was an enthusiastic recruit to the Nazis in Belgium. He was smuggled into Ireland with the help of the church.
Staff van Veldhoven is a, intriguing figure. He was born in 1920 in Antwerp. He got involved in a very tiny movement in Antwerp, which was called the Dietse Opvoedkundige Beweging, which was really a movement very close to National Socialism. Then, during the war, he got involved in the Waffen-SS. He got within the Waffen-SS towards the most extreme groups.
I'm on the road to Kinvara in the County Galway. An odd place to discover one of the last survivors of an SS elite regiment. In 1943, as a regular SS soldier, Staff van Veldhoven joined the elite SS commandos of Jaeger Battalion 502, commanded by Hitler's favorite soldier, Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny would also come to Ireland after the war.
One day we were told that Skorzeny had arrived, which we all knew, of course. He had become a legend after he got Mussolini out. And that was looking for volunteers. So I volunteered for the 502.
Staff van Veldhoven became an explosive expert for the SS commandos and spent most of his time trying to stall the Allied advance through Europe. In spring 1945, as the 502 joined the retreat into Germany, Staff van Veldhoven was wounded in an air attack and taken to a military hospital.
We were barely a few days in there when the hospital was taken by the Americans. So
that was the end of your war.
That was the end of my war, yeah.
The Americans sent Staff van Veldhoven back to Belgium, where he was sentenced to 20 years hard labor for collaboration. He managed to escape from prison, but had to get out of Belgium. For a Flemish Nazi like Staff van Veldhoven, Ireland seemed the perfect safe haven.
I was told that some of our people had gone to Ireland and they had been given asylum. And what did I think about that? Now, very early on in our movement, we had discussed that sooner or later we might have to take up weapons to get our aims fulfilled, you see. So my first idea was, yeah, Ireland, IRA, I can learn something there. So that's that's how I decided, yeah, okay, I go to Ireland.
How did you get here?
Well, we were smuggled across the Dutch border. We had to go through a convent with a Trappist, and this convent or a monastery is at the border of Holland and Belgium. The front door is Belgium, the back door is Holland. We got a plane from Amsterdam via Manchester and arrived in Dublin Airport.
This became an established escape route from Belgium to Ireland. In Ireland, Staff van Veldhoven was drawn into Republican politics and became a prominent figure associated with protest in Ireland. Another Flemish nationalist who followed the same escape route as Staff van Veldhoven would find Ireland an even more welcoming location. He became a hugely successful entrepreneur. His name is Albert Folens, the leading educational publisher in post-war Ireland. It is 1947 and the word is out that Ireland is a safe haven for Flemish collaborators who are fleeing the Belgian authorities. Albert Folens, a man who penetrated the heart of Irish business, was one of those smuggled in here. I have discovered evidence that Folens' wartime career is not all it appears to be.
Therefore, you're going to have any comprehension for what I have done during the war. So how can you understand that we cooperate wholeheartedly with the Germans? We can only get rescue from the Germans.
Albert Folens is a person who would have been synonymous with most people's education insofar as he set up a publishing company that was immensely successful in Ireland. They produced textbooks, they produced copybooks, and he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs that took off in Ireland after the end of the Second World War.
But during the war, Folens was a member of the Nazi SS and became part of the SS security police, the Sicherheitsdienst. The Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, were feared across Europe. In Belgium, they were responsible for maintaining order and security and for rounding up Jews. Mrs. Juliet Folens, widow of Albert Folens and her family, do not accept that Mr. Folens was a member of the Nazi Party, was ever a member of or employed by the Gestapo, or ever worked in their headquarters in Brussels. You knew Albert Folens, I gather.
Yeah.
How did you come across him?
Well, while I was waiting for my transfer to Ireland to be arranged, you see, I was put into a place where people could come for recuperation. And that's where I met Folens. We asked each other, what are you in for, you said. Mm-hmm. And he, in fact, said at that time that all during the war he had been working in the offices of the German Sicherheitsdienst, you know.
And what were they?
Well, that's what you call the Gestapo, you know.
Albert Folens was born in a small village called Bissegame in Flanders in 1916. He grew up in a very religious family. He went away to a quasi-religious boarding school. And after that, he entered a seminary. When the Germans overran the Low Countries and came into Belgium, all of a sudden, Albert Folens departed the seminary. It's not entirely clear why. He was 23 at the time, but his next move was to join a Flemish nationalist unit of the Waffen-SS.
However, Folens never saw frontline action. After military training, his SS career was cut short by a perforated ulcer.
After his recovery period, he was allowed to go home. He continued to volunteer his services to the German forces. He became involved with the Sicherheitsdienst, which means literally secret service.
When a member of the Waffen-SS, so a Flemish volunteer in the Waffen-SS, could not fight at the front, they were sent back to Belgium, serving at the home front against the resistance and so on. And some of them got transferred to the SIPO SD, so to the intelligence service and the police force of the SS in occupied territory.
Albert Volens, from the time Belgium was liberated, became a wanted man. He withdrew after the fall of Brussels and Antwerp and so on, back into Greater Germany. And he was finally arrested, as I understand it, by British troops. He was interned by the British, who eventually repatriated him to Belgium, where he was wanted for treason.
For this military collaboration, he was convicted by Belgian justice after the war to 10 years of imprisonment. But after 2 years, he flees, and in 1948 he went into Ireland.
Volens followed the same escape route into Ireland as Staff van Veldhoven, being smuggled here by Trappist monks. He became one of Ireland's leading entrepreneurs, establishing a renowned publishing business. But Volens remained an elusive figure. However, before his death, he gave an interview in a Flemish publication in which he described himself as, and I quote, a war criminal in an honourable cause. In this article, he made a reference to a controversial interview he had given Irish journalist Senan Maloney in 1985 about his wartime activities. This interview has never been published or broadcast before, but it and other evidence raises serious questions about how active a Nazi Ireland's leading educational publisher really was.
Albert Volens had a plausible story made out, a script to which he attempted to stick as we went through what he did during the war. And as he was confronted with various things, he had a line of fallback positions in relation to what he actually did. He denied that he was in the Waffen-SS. He conceded that he was a mere foot soldier on the Eastern Front, had been invalided out, and then he claimed that he had lived quietly for the rest of the war.
So the Flemish legions were formed by under the understanding that you would have our own Flemish legion, our own insignia, and everything would be independent.
And you're saying they were set up by the Waffen-SS?
And gradually they started to incorporate us in the Waffen-SS.
It later descended into something of a rant. He made the point from his outlook that what had the Allies gained by waging and winning the Second World War? He made the claim that in fact they'd sown the seeds of their own destruction because they had given away too much territory to the Red Army.
I still think that the Americans are stupid and criminal to have asked for a complete surrender. But no, to please Stalin, they want the complete surrender and the complete vacuum in Middle Europe, so that the Hungarians, the Czechs, and so on and so on and so on, all now are under Russian domination. And that's the stupidity of the Roosevelt, a sick man with a sick mind and ignorance.
But the interview became even more extraordinary and intriguing when Volens was asked about his life with the SD, the SS security police. Volens claimed that he'd had a minor role with the SD and that he was not involved in any police work, interrogation or war crimes.
So then in the SD, I was in Abteilung or in Department 3C, B, that was Lektorat. Now the whole Abteilung 3 consisted of no police work whatsoever. It was only keeping an eye on the future development of Flanders and of Belgium. And gathering information on people who might be useful for this or for that and for everything.
Was Volens really a minor player or a more active Nazi? 21 years ago, Senan Maloney came to Brussels to investigate Volens' wartime career. In the Soma archive, one of Europe's leading archives on World War II, Senan shows me a list of security suspects wanted by the Allies after the war. This list is known as the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, or CROCAS. the Allies called the Crocas lists the Nazi Hunter's Bible.
So here we can see this is a long list of suspects involving thousands of names, hundreds and hundreds of names under every letter of the alphabet. Folens is here, and there's a file number, and he's down as an interpreter with the SIPO. The SIPO is the Sicherheitspolizei, the secret police, in Department 3B at the Gestapo building in Brussels.
The Sicherheitspolizei, or SIPO, was the name of the combined forces of the Gestapo and the SD. From its headquarters on the Avenue Louise in Brussels, the SIPO SD carried out its work against the resistance in Belgium.
So here we are, Cathal, 21 years after I was last here at number 453 Avenue Louise. This was the Gestapo headquarters during wartime, which was responsible for the security and surveillance of the entirety of the Belgian capital of Brussels. So this is where Folens worked on the 5th floor.
When it says that he was an interpreter on those documents, what did that mean?
Well, Albert Folens always said, of course, that he was a translator, as if he was just copying things from one piece of paper to another. But an interpreter, as we all know, does exactly what we're doing now. He's involved in talking and the human interaction.
In fact, an interpreter in the Nazi SD could have been involved in talking to resistance suspects and captured Allied airmen, some of whom may be facing interrogation.
There's a little plaque just to the right of the door. Right. That commemorates the fact that this was a very dark place indeed.
But Folens remains an enigma, and questions remain unanswered about the wartime career of Ireland's leading educational publisher. One of Folens' fellow countrymen, another Nazi collaborator, would have a major impact on the business and political life of this country. His name is Albert Lykes.
Albert Lykes has been described as being a Belgian businessman. In fact, he would be extremely unlikely to have described himself in this manner because he actually was a Flemish nationalist.
Albert Lykes was a member of the Black Brigade, and the Black Brigade was in fact a paramilitary organization within the Flemish National League. The Flemish National League was the most important Flemish nationalist party that collaborated during the Second World War. Lykes was a member of a family of furniture makers in Limburg, and during the war they made barracks for the German army, as other furniture makers did in France. So he was condemned afterward for economic collaboration too.
In 1941, Albert Lykes and the Black Brigade had a run-in with Belgian Louis Remus when he mocked them for being collaborators. Lykes would have his revenge on Remus.
Na 2 maanden, in juni 1942, toen kwam middags de veldgendarmerie met een dorppolicist. Die wilde mich dan vastnemen. Hebben ze mij vastgenomen. Dan wilde de commandant mich nog vrij behouden, maar Albert Lykes stand erop. Ik zou vastgenomen werden en in de gevangenis gestoken werden. Door Albert Lykes heb ik dan die 3,5 jaar zuchthuis bekomen.
When the war ended, the Belgian authorities caught up with Albert Lykes.
Albert Lykes was convicted by Belgian justice to the death penalty, and then it was reduced to 20 years, but he escaped and flees to Ireland.
Lykes travelled the well-established routes from Flanders into Ireland. Like Folens, he quickly infiltrated Irish society, establishing a successful restaurant business.
It was unclear who Albert Lykes was. He arrived in Ireland in 1948. He ran a restaurant in Sutton. Sutton, then as now, I suppose, is part of the Fianna Fáil heartland.
In the 1950s and 60s, Albert Lykes ingratiated himself into the very core of the Fianna Fáil political party. In May 1970, the biggest political scandal in the history of the Irish state occurred when two government ministers, Charles Haughey and Neil Blaney, were accused of attempting to illegally import weapons for the Provisional IRA. Albert Lykes was at the centre of this case.
Initially, 5 people were charged. First, Neil Blaney, who was the real driving force in all of this. But interestingly, not enough evidence emerged at the time to justify his prosecution, so charges against Blaney were dropped. That left 4. The 4 were Charles Haughey, former Minister of Finance, John Kelly, who was a leading Belfast Republican, Captain Kelly, an officer in military intelligence, and Albert Lykes, who was a confidant of Neil Blaney.
Neil Blaney called for the former Nazi Albert Lykes' aid because he spoke German. Blaney sent Albert Lykes to Europe to acquire guns for the Provisional IRA from Hamburg arms dealer Otto Schluter. It was here that their plans became unstuck.
I'm not sure that there's any evidence to suggest that Albert Lykes was an arms dealer par excellence. Certainly, if you want to look at Schluter's evidence, Albert Lykes was a complete fool, a complete naive fool, basically, when it came to trying to bring in weapons. Because at the time, to bring in weapons legally, you needed to have what was known as an end-user certificate. That could only be provided by the Department of Defense or the Department of Justice. Lykes didn't know this. And so when the first attempt to bring the weapons in by ship failed, it failed because the Belgian authorities in Antwerp refused to actually load them onto the ship. There was no end-user certificate. And Schluter thought that this was evidence that these people were complete idiots. Innocence abroad. When the trial took place, Peter Berry, who was the secretary in the Department of Justice, started to read out from confidential minutes, which suggested that Albert Lykes had not engaged in subversive activity since his arrival in Ireland, which clearly gave the inference that he had been involved in subversive activity beforehand, at which stage Albert Lykes' counsel demanded an immediate retraction, demanded that the judge disregard the evidence, and accused the judge of bias for allowing Berry to continue, at which stage the judge, Andrew O'Keefe, who was president of the High Court, said, "I am declaring a mistrial." And the trial ended. Interestingly, when it came to the second trial, no mention was made of this. And when the 4 were ultimately acquitted, Albert Lykes retreated into the mist.
Shame, my bottom is sore from sitting on them hard seats. No.
In May 1959, one of the most colourful and controversial figures in the Nazi regime came to Ireland. It was welcomed by many people in Dublin and Kildare. Otto Skorzeny, an SS Obergruppenführer, a man once dubbed the most dangerous man in Europe, announced that he'd bought Martinstown House in the Curragh, County Kildare. It caused convulsions in the Dáil, and opposition TDs were having a field day.
The Irish government seemed quite ambivalent about Skorzeny. On the one hand, they were very well aware of his past, but on the other hand, they seemed to not be too concerned about some of his Nazi activities. Curiously, Haughey actually dealt with the Skorzeny case. He was asked a question about it in the Dáil by Noel Brown, the socialist TD. Brown was concerned that Skorzeny had been involved in various Nazi activities and might still be involved. He was concerned that he might use Ireland as a base for neo-Nazi activities, and Haughey pretty well brushed the question aside.
40 years on, it seems hard to understand what all the fuss was about. But then you must remember that Otto Skorzeny was one of the most famous soldiers of the Second World War. And as this file in the Irish National Archives shows, the Irish government was worried about why he should want to come and live in this country. Even then, you see, he was a pin-up boy for the Nazi Party.
Otto Skorzeny became a member of the Austrian Nazi Party in 1931 while he was a student. When war came, Skorzeny actually wanted to be a pilot, but was turned down by the Luftwaffe and ended up joining the Waffen-SS.
Skorzeny first saw action during the invasion of Russia, where he gained a reputation as a daring soldier and a brilliant leader.
If we go back to 1941, during his time on the Eastern Front, he was wounded by shrapnel from a shell burst. Instead of lying back and being bandaged and evacuated to the rear, Skorzeny, once his head had been bandaged, merely said, "I want some aspirins and schnapps," took both, and then went back to the front line and continued fighting.
When he returned from the Russian front, Hitler personally appointed Skorzeny to lead an elite commando unit, SS Jäger Battalion 502, tasked with getting Hitler out of sticky situations.
Skorzeny really first came to public notice with his dramatic rescue of Mussolini in September 1943.
When the Allies invaded Italy, Mussolini was overthrown and imprisoned in a secret location. Hitler was determined to rescue his old ally. After a 3-month game of cat and mouse, Skorzeny found Mussolini hidden at the Hotel Imperator deep within the Gran Sasso mountain range.
Now, if you look at the map here, then you'll see running southwest, there is a funicular railway marked on the map, and it was the only way by which the hotel could be reached. The guy who actually drew up the plan was General Karl Student, the German parachute commander. He decided to use gliders, and the gliders would fly in, containing Skorzeny and his men, plus some additional paratroops. The paratroops in the group, they immediately seized the upper funicular station, while Skorzeny, his men, rushed into the hotel, and there they found Mussolini, and Skorzeny said to him, "Il Duce, I am here to rescue you."
In the morning, Mussolini, with Skorzeny at his side, was paraded in front of the world's press. Everybody wanted to know who was Otto Skorzeny. After rescuing Mussolini, Hitler immediately made Otto Skorzeny a leading military troubleshooter, the man the Nazis called on for daring and desperate operations. In December 1944, Skorzeny had his last hurrah. During the Battle of the Bulge, Skorzeny sent 24 German soldiers dressed in captured American uniforms behind the Allied lines to sow disorder and confusion.
Now, some were captured fairly early on by the Americans and shot. But the Americans were so panicked that General Eisenhower was ordered by his security people not to move from his headquarters for 3 days. So he was actually trapped as a result of these few Germans in captured uniforms.
In 1945, he surrendered to the Americans, and he was tried for war crimes arising out of the Battle of the Bulge.
However, the case collapsed when top British secret agent Wing Commander Yo Thomas testified that the Allies had used captured German uniforms as disguises during D-Day.
Germans themselves wanted to try Skorzeny, but actually he managed to escape from prison in rather shady circumstances.
He organized for vehicles with ostensibly American plates or American identification to turn up at the prison, and they were actually people who had come to snatch him from the prison.
Skorzeny fled to Franco's Spain, where he continued to have a colourful career. It's alleged that he ran Odessa, spiriting Nazi war criminals into Latin America, and was even believed to have had an affair with Eva Peron. the late 1950s, Scorzeni bought Martinstown House in County Kildare and announced his intention to move to Ireland. Scorzeni's file in the Irish National Archive contains a memo from the Irish Embassy in Spain written in 1964. The ambassador writes that Scorzeni was claiming that he was a Spanish correspondent for the Irish Times. Well, now, I was a reporter in the Irish Times in those years, and I can assure you that Otto Scorzeni was not on the payroll.
2 years before he bought Martinstown, there was actually a reception, a party for Scorzeni held at Portmarnock Country Club just outside Dublin. And a lot of leading pillars of Dublin society, professional people attended, including Charles Haughey, who was then a backbench TD, later to become Minister for Justice. There doesn't seem to be that much negative reaction in Ireland to Scorzeni. There was an interview in 1963 in the Sunday Press with his wife Ilse, and she's described as a lovely blonde lady with blue eyes in a mink coat. The whole tone of it doesn't really dwell on the dark side of the Nazi era, but rather almost suggests that the accusations against him about war crimes or other Nazi activities were part of some kind of Red or Soviet plot.
The bomb-blasted room where an explosion nearly got Hitler. Sees Nazi film pictures the scene.
In July 1944, the German resistance attempted to kill Adolf Hitler. Scorzeni was brought in by Hitler to hunt down those associated with the plot.
My mother was the daughter of Fritz von der Schulenburg, one of the ringleaders of the July plot to assassinate Hitler, and he was subsequently executed. Scorzeni had actually been involved in rounding up all the people involved in the plot.
In spite of his standing within Irish society, Otto Scorzeni certainly had a dark side. One man who witnessed this was ex-British officer Dusty Miller. So here it is, Dusty, after what? How many years?
Over 55 years, I think it must be. 57.
But it's still a fine-looking house.
Oh, it is.
Neat.
It is, yes.
Dusty was a technical advisor with Bord na Móna. He was invited to dinner with Scorzeni to discuss developing the bog on Scorzeni's land. Well, here it is.
The dining room. Yeah. The famous dining room where we met Scorzeni.
Yes.
We've both been soldiers in different parts of the same war. I was in the Far East, he was in Europe. And I felt a certain kinship there, but then I began to think about the strategy of the German army going into Russia, as a military man would, I suppose. And I said to him, one thing surprises me about the German invasion of Russia, and that is that the Russian people, the villages you were going through in the Urals, if the Germans had been friendly with them, it surely would have made the whole battle of the Russia much easier. And at that, there was silence, and he said, it's not possible to make friends with them. I said, why? He said, because they are subhuman. But that brought me right back with a bang to realize that here was someone who was with evil thoughts anyway, and I don't think we needed those kind of people living in Ireland.
In 1964, Otto Scorzeni tired of Ireland. He returned to Madrid, where he would spend the rest of his days. He died of cancer in 1975. On my journey, I've uncovered only a handful of the Nazis who came into this country. Ireland played a willing host to them. Whether it was Helmut Klisman, the Nazi intelligence officer, Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite soldier, or Albert Leix, a man sentenced to death for his wartime actions, what is remarkable is how former Nazis were able to come into Ireland and penetrate every level of Irish society. I believe that the Cold War, which emerged out of the chaos of post-war Europe, allowed Ireland to ignore the horrors of the Nazi regime and the Irish state to play host to Nazi war criminals. Even today, we don't know the full story, as the Irish government has refused to release all the files on the Nazis who came to Ireland. It's time then, isn't it, that Ireland faced its Nazi past, which remains a dark stain on our recent history.